The whisper of hollow voices. The late 1970s in California brought with it the shimmering sun, the endless sky, and the soft winds that brushed over fields of gold. But beneath the beauty of the Golden State, an unsettling terror began to grow. A shadow that haunted the suburbs, twisted its way through the night, and destroyed lives in its wake. He was known only by his many aliases: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and later, the Golden State Killer. His reign of terror lasted over a decade, marked by unrelenting brutality, calculated precision, and chilling silence. His name, Joseph James DeAngelo, would only come to be known years later. But by then, the damage had already been done. The man who became the monster was not someone who stood out in the crowd. DeAngelo was a former police officer, someone who had once sworn an oath to protect and serve the very community that would later become his prey. His ability to blend into his environment, to hide in plain sight, was one of the many reasons he was able to evade detection for so long. His methodical nature made him a master of terror. He attacked when least expected, and by the time authorities realized the scope of his crimes, he had already disappeared into the shadows once again. The following is a chilling recount of the Golden State Killer's crimes, the lives he destroyed, and the years it took for his dark legacy to finally unravel. The beginning of terror. The first attack happened in 1976 in the city of Sacramento, California. It started as a series of seemingly isolated incidents. Women, alone in their homes, were violated in ways that were both brutal and terrifying. At first, it seemed like a series of burglaries, with nothing stolen except the peace of mind of the victims. The East Area Rapist, as he would later be known, would enter homes at night, bind his victims, and assault them. His attacks were meticulous. He wore gloves, avoided leaving fingerprints, and knew how to escape undetected, often by bicycle. In these early attacks, there was a pattern. He targeted women in their homes, often taking advantage of windows left open or doors left unlocked. His method was terrifyingly familiar. He would wake his victims with a gun pressed to their heads, then force them into submission, sometimes hours at a time. He was known for his cold threats, chilling phrases whispered in the dark, like, "Don't move or I'll make you silent forever." Words that would echo in his victims' minds long after the crime was over. There was one victim, a young woman in Sacramento, who survived his attack and provided the first clue, a vague description of a man wearing a ski mask. But that was all. The East Area Rapist was a phantom, slipping through cracks, disappearing into the darkness. The escalation. By 1979, the crimes took an even darker turn. DeAngelo's brutal attacks on women were no longer enough. He wanted more than just control over his victims' bodies. He wanted to dominate their lives, and he did so with brutal violence. He shifted his focus from burglary and rape to murder, marking the beginning of his reign as the original Night Stalker. The first murders occurred in 1979, when he killed a young couple, Brian and Katie Maggiore, in Santa Barbara, Dotting. They had been walking their dog in the early evening, unsuspecting of the predator that lurked nearby. When they returned to their home, they were ambushed. DeAngelo, hiding in the shadows, shot both of them as they slept, then fled the scene. The horror of the Maggiore murders marked a significant shift in the killer's pattern. Now, he wasn't just terrorizing victims in their homes. He was taking their lives as well. The brutality of these attacks left the community in shambles. The once safe, suburban homes were now fear-filled zones, where each creak of a floorboard, each gust of wind, set off a wave of panic. The police, already stretched thin, had no solid leads. They could not connect the earlier rapes to the murders. They were simply too different. No one could fathom that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. DeAngelo had perfected his strategy. He was both a ghost and a monster, blending into society while wreaking havoc on it. The hunt for a ghost. As DeAngelo's crimes grew more horrific, so did the fear among the residents of California. No one felt safe anymore. His attacks seemed random, yet deliberate. A young woman would be assaulted in her home one night, then a couple would be shot in their bed the next. And all the while, the police were left with little to go on. There were no solid clues, no tangible leads. The idea that the same person was responsible for both the rapes and the murders seemed impossible. But there was one woman who refused to accept the uncertainty. Michelle McNamara was a writer who became obsessed with the case. As a true crime enthusiast, she had pored over every detail of the Golden State Killer's crimes. She was fascinated by the brutality of the attacks. But what drove her was the frustration of a mystery unsolved. In her pursuit of the killer, McNamara started to connect dots that others hadn't. She wrote for years about the case, piecing together the disturbing narrative of a man who had moved across California, leaving a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. She was determined to solve the mystery, even as she became more consumed by the case. She knew, deep down, that the killer wasn't some ghost. He was a man, and every man left a trail. McNamara's work culminated in the release of her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, a gripping account of her investigation into the Golden State Killer. Tragically, McNamara passed away before she could see the resolution of the case she had dedicated so much of her life to solving. But her work had reignited the public's interest in the case and sparked a new wave of investigation. The DNA breakthrough. It wasn't until 2016 that the case truly began to crack. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the time of DeAngelo's initial attacks, and investigators began to revisit the old crime scenes, hoping to find new leads. Using genetic genealogy, they uploaded DNA evidence from one of the crime scenes to a public genealogy database. This led to a distant relative of DeAngelo, whose family tree was traced all the way back to him. With this breakthrough, authorities were able to focus their investigation on one man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living in Sacramento. The man who had once been part of the system now found himself at the center of it, his past crimes closing in on him. Police staked out his home, watching him closely. On April 24, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested, marking the end of a 40-year manhunt. DeAngelo's capture sent shockwaves through the community. The man who had terrorized California for so long was finally in custody. But for the victims, the damage had already been done. For many, the arrest was bittersweet. Yes, there was justice. But the years of pain, trauma, and fear could never be undone. DeAngelo's reign of terror had left permanent scars on those he had violated, and while they finally knew his name, the terror he had instilled in them would never fade. The legacy of terror. Joseph James DeAngelo was charged with numerous counts of murder, rape, and burglary. As the investigation continued, more victims came forward, sharing their harrowing stories of survival and loss. The truth about DeAngelo's monstrous acts was slowly revealed, piece by piece. The public learned that the East Area rapist had attacked at least 50 women and killed 12 people across California, his victims spanning multiple counties. The horror that one man had unleashed upon the state was almost too much to comprehend. But in the end, DeAngelo's capture brought closure to many. The survivors of his assaults, the families of his victims, and the community as a whole could breathe a little easier knowing that the man who had stolen so many lives was finally behind bars. However, this closure did not wipe away the darkness that lingered in the wake of his reign of terror. For many, the nightmares didn't end with his arrest. The trauma had been too deep, the scars too ingrained. What made the Golden State Killer so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the complete sense of helplessness he instilled in his victims. No one was safe. He didn't discriminate. He targeted women, men, couples, even children. In the dead of night, he crept into homes. His presence felt only when it was too late to escape. And the fear he instilled didn't end with his victims. It spread like a disease, infecting the very soul of the community. As DeAngelo sat in court awaiting his sentence, the victims spoke of their pain. They spoke of the terror they had lived through, the years of torment that followed his attacks, and the years they had spent in fear of the man who had taken so much from them. In the end, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that sentence could not undo the damage he had caused. His name would be remembered, not just for the pain he had caused, but for the lives he had destroyed in the shadows of California's Golden Hills. And for those who had lived through his reign of terror, the house on Hollow Hill, the whispers in the dark, and the words of the killer would haunt them forever. I'll be gone in the dark, but you will never forget.